üritan hiljem rääkima hakata inglise keeles, sest tõlge on kõigil olemas, on ju. Kuna meie panelistid eesti keelt paraku veel ei valda, siis ikkagi üritame olla viisakad. Ma tänan, te tulite, ma tänan selle huvi eest. Ma eraldi tänan, Valle, ma tänan selliseks mu koti. Ma tänan siis kõiki, kes tulid, kes näitasid üles huvi. Meil on käsil autoõiguste direktiiv, mis läheb hääletusele Strasbourgis teisipäeval. Ja meil on õrn lootus, et võib-olla me hääletame selle mitte maha, vaid me hääletame selle poolt, jättes välja 2 artiklit, mis meie arvates ei ole head. Aga võib-olla tänase diskussiooni pinnalt ma muudan meelt, kes teab. Et vaatame, räägime nagu kuidas läheb, ja mul on hea meel kutsudes siia Milan Zubicek, kes on Euroopa Google'i esindaja. Milan, where are you?
I'm here.
Yes, thank you for coming. Very glad that you found time. Ja Ahto Logekas, kes siis modereerib seda meie diskussiooni. Ja ma usun, et tänu Ahtole osaliselt see saal sai täna täis, sest eile me põhjalikult arutasime seda raadios. Ja ausalt öeldes mul võttis sellepärast, et ma nägin kurja vaeva, et kuidagi nagu tekitada Eesti meedia poolt huvi selle teema vastu. Aga lõpuks huvi on tekitatud, nii et tänud ka ajakirjanikele, kes te tulite kohale. Ja meil on siis Skype'i teel ühenduses. Vlaada saan ma õigesti aru, et esimene on meil Wikipedia, on ju?
Vaata selja täna.
Yes, I don't know if you see me, but sorry. Like that. Thank you for coming, thank you for joining us. And now moderator after Logicus will sit like that, just to keep an eye on you. So thank you for coming, and let's start.
Ma tahan.
Ja suur aitäh, et te täna tulite. Väga väike tehniline ettepanek minu poolt. Kas te kõik, kes ei osanud panna oma kõlge vastuvõtjad tööle, olge nii kena tõstke käsi. Väga hea. Ühesõnaga, pange palun klapid selle vastuvõtja seadme sisse. Klapid sisse. Пожалуйста, наушники ставьте в приемник перевода, нажмите на кнопку «Включить». И тогда у нас есть 2 канала перевода. Эстонский язык на первом канале, английский на втором. Ja niimoodi, et eestikeelseks tõlkeks valige esimene kanal, ingliskeelseks tõlkeks vajage teine kanal. And for English-speaking friends, if you require a translation to Estonian, which you obviously do, choose channel number 1. And for English translation, choose channel number 2. Thank you so much. And this was very technical disruption we're going to have. Thank you.
I seem to be clear to start proceedings or maybe not.
No, I just wanted to say, sorry, that this gentleman here is founder of Wikipedia, Jimmy Wells, and yes, and I know that some journalists were interested in having an interview with him, but we have technical possibility to ask him questions, not for interview, but just to ask him questions.
So it is my distinct pleasure to introduce this first panel of today's 2-panel occasion. My name is Ahto Logekas. I thank Jan Hall for this very kind introduction. I am something of a journalist, something of a radio, something of jack of all trades. I freely admit that I am very confused about what's at issue here, and I also expect or hope that I myself will be able to learn from this and go away a lot more informed than I am. I think my condition is indicative of a wider problem, the very wide problem of this issue, speaking to a very small number of people, at least relatively speaking. I'm very happy to see the room here full of people, almost full, but it seems to me that a vast majority of Estonians and Europeans have really no idea what's coming. And part of this panel now part of the task of this panel, I would say, is now to try and respond to this, and this panel is entitled, my glasses aren't as good as I thought, but anyway, we're supposed to be talking about the impact this copyright directive will have on platforms, and we have representatives of 3 different platforms here, interestingly enough. One is the European Parliament, which will be a massive part of the decision-making procedure, and we should see after next Tuesday what will happen. We have a representative from Google here. I'll let you introduce yourselves a bit later on, and we have Jimmy Wiles representing Wikipedia. Now, as I said, you all represent very different platforms, and one thing that I'd like to not necessarily ask, but just perhaps share very briefly some of my own musings on this topic. It seems to me that there seem to be no winners in this. I'm heartened to see who this directive is going to benefit, other than maybe large agglomerated rights holders, representatives of whom we do not have here today. But it seems to me that even large platforms like Google should not be all too happy about what is going to happen in Europe. So perhaps I can start with you, and again, I'm really sorry, but Milan Zubic, please.
Yes, that's correct. Well, first of all, thank you so much for inviting me to this important panel, and very timely panel, because as has been said, now is a crunch time, and the European Parliament will be deciding very soon about the final sort of look of the directive. If I may, I will talk about at least in the introductory remarks about Article 13, which I think is the most sort of controversial article of the whole directive. But then I'm very happy to talk about other parts of the directive, and this Article 13 is basically about the cooperation between rights holders and the online platforms, and about the remuneration of the copyrighted material by the platforms, and who is responsible for the copyright infringement, very sort of on a basic level. And first of all, let me really underline that our company supports the overall idea of Article 13, which is to support European creators, and we are working quite hard on this area as well, working very closely with the creators in Europe and globally, be it on YouTube and other platforms that we operate, and we are working on compensating creators on the value that they are creating on YouTube. If I may, just quick numbers. Only in the last 12 months, we've paid European creators 800 million euros. So this is the real income, and over the last 5 years, we paid the music industry more than 5 billion euros. So this is the real value that we are creating, and of course, when you look at the overall numbers, the revenues coming from online platforms are constantly growing over the last couple of years. Before you saw this sort of drop in the internet, now you see that the revenues are going back to the original numbers. When it comes to this specific directive, what we are trying to warn against are potential unintended consequences that we might be facing, because as it is always with anything in life, the devil is in the details. So even if we agree on the basic ideas, and we agree that the idea is good, we need to work out a workable solution for the whole European Union. And here we are seeing some concerns related to the directive. I will not go into very detail, because there has been discussions about this for years. So let me just really talk about the final text, and what are the key concerns that we are seeing with the text that is going to be decided upon in the European Parliament. Especially, there is a necessary need for clarification of the relationship between the online platforms and the right holders, Because if you shift this pendulum towards the platform's liability, the natural reaction of the platforms might be to over-filter content just to prevent fines put on them. Because the cooperation is absolutely necessary. Platforms need to know who is the right holder, what is the exact material that is copyrighted, so that they can take an action. And now when we're talking about impact on companies such as Google, imagine what might be the impact on smaller European platforms, smaller European companies that simply don't have the capacities, don't have the engineering power, and don't have the money to invest into these systems. So what we've been also saying is that there is a better way, a way of cooperation between the rights holders and the platforms, where the licensing is being fair and the licensing is being worked upon, and where also a technology comes in place. In our case, the technology that we are using, some of you might have heard, is called Content ID. This is being used for YouTube, and maybe just very quickly how this works in practice, because this is very important. Content ID works in a sense when right holders provide us as a platform with reference files, materials that they own. We put this in our system, and then whenever anyone uploads some file on YouTube, thanks to the Content ID, we can cross-check the material that is being uploaded with the material that is being that a right holder owns. And if there is a match between these two, then right holders get to decide what they want to do with the material that someone else uploaded. There are three options. First option is to take it down, so the material is not even uploaded. The second option is to keep it up, and they can use the analytics, which is also quite important now in the digital economy, to know who is watching the videos, from where they are coming, what's their aim. So knowing about the user. And the third option is that the material that someone else uploaded stays uploaded, and all the revenues from advertisement that is screened against this material goes to the right holder. By the way, some 90% of right holders decide to go with the third option, and they are monetizing this content themselves. By now, this has generated some 2.5 billion euros to rights holders. This is revenue that right holders don't really have to pay for. They don't need to do much, just control the system from time to time. And this is an added value above of what they would otherwise would not make. The problems here are, as I sort of pointed out to, it is extremely expensive. It is something that needs to be updated, and even if it works in some 98% of copyright management on YouTube is taken by a Content ID, it is not perfect. You need to have this input from the right holders, because otherwise Content ID would not work. So where again the concern is that if you bypass this and put too much pressure on the platforms, even such a strong technology might not work. So coming back to the basic point is, we see some progress. The final version is better than the one before, but we are really concerned about these unintended consequences and trying to explain to policymakers how they might negatively affect European businesses, creators, and also users.
Thank you for this. Very, very briefly, and I'm sorry I'm going to put this very primitively, but if you get what you want, you as Google and perhaps the other big commercial platforms, will that mean that the upload filter issue will go away? That we will have an internet without upload filters? Your plan A, basically.
Well, it is hard to say right now to answer yes or no, because we are already working together with the right holders, because we don't want our platform to be sort of Wild West when anyone can upload anything. That is why we developed this Content ID. It was not any obligation to come up with such tool, but we want to create a joint value. So we are trying to fight against online piracy, This is the basic idea of the copyright directive, and I think we can all agree on this. And we want to prevent clearly pirate content to be uploaded. But the negative consequence, if the legislation is not right, might be that it will not really help fight against the piracy, and on the other hand, it might harm those that are trying to do the right thing.
Right, thank you. I'd also like to thank Jimmy Wales, who's been hanging on our walls very patiently. I'm not sure what your angle is or what you can see of this room, but you're very prominently present on two screens here. I personally do not have much experience with YouTube and any of the large commercial platforms. I'm too old for these things, but I do use Wikipedia, and I noticed that yesterday the German Wikipedia site was down in protest, and I have to say I was doing something one day earlier that I would have been unable to do had I delayed it, and that outage would have hit me very personally in some of my professional capacity. So I'm worried, shall I say, and what I'd like to ask you is what might happen to Wikipedia if this Article 13, Article 11 business were to now materialise the way it seems to be about to materialise. Thank you.
Yeah, so one of the things that has made our efforts to raise awareness around this and to protest against this more complicated is that they have written into Article 13 an exemption for any non-profit encyclopedias. There's only one, really, that's Wikipedia. So we have a direct exemption from Article 13, which I think they thought would shut us up, because I think they really understood that we are the one group of people who are genuinely a community. These things don't get decided top down. So, for example, the protest yesterday was in the German, Czech, Danish, and Slovak Wikipedias. Other Wikipedia language versions are still discussing what they may or may not do, but these things come from the communities. They control that. That's not controlled by me or by the Wikimedia Foundation. And so we do have a loud voice because people do love Wikipedia and they love the gift that we've given. So it hasn't shut us up at all. We're very unhappy about this. And we're unhappy about it because we are fundamentally about internet users. We're fundamentally about an open internet, about the free sharing of knowledge. And we find that this approach to dealing with issues that have to do really with the negotiating stance of, for example, the music industry and YouTube, which, by the way, when I've spoken to people, music industry representatives, this is their number one concern. They would like to get more money out of Google. Okay, well, that's really, sorry, Google, but that's your problem. If there's a way to get more money out of YouTube, that's fine. I actually think the bigger problem in the music industry is that of the revenue that the music industry receives, only 8% or so goes to the artists. So when the music industry comes forward with a sob story about artists, I think there's a deeper issue there around how are artists properly compensated. But I want to talk just about a couple of specific examples. I was speaking to the owner of, heard from the owner of a small internet message board that's all about Tolkien's works, so Lord of the Rings. And so this is a community of people who discuss the movies, they discuss books, they discuss the whole Tolkien universe, they discuss other sort of fantasy fiction and so on. Well, this copyright directive has an exemption for small and medium enterprises. However, the exemption is so badly done that it applies, you no longer qualify if you've existed for 3 years. It doesn't matter how much your revenue is. If you've been around for 3 years, then you are subject to the exact same regulations as Google, Facebook, Twitter, and all the internet giants. So this owner of this message board is deeply concerned because he has a safe harbor right now. If any of his users shares a picture from a movie or a short clip or something longer, he's not liable for that. And if he gets a takedown notice, then he has to take it down. And that system has worked very, very well for a long time. Now he will be potentially liable from the moment that's uploaded, unless he proactively buys licenses to everything that anybody might possibly upload, or if he finds some kind of way of having some kind of technology. But this is really a bit of a fantasy, because it's one thing for Google to identify a whole track of music, and even for Google, questions around what constitutes fair use are very difficult to algorithmically address. And certainly for a small message board, the only thing you can really do is disable uploads, or, and I think this is an interesting thing for those of us who live in Europe. I live in the UK. If you go right now in the UK, and I assume there as well, you try to visit the Chicago Tribune's website. Chicago Tribune is the largest and most important paper in Chicago, in the United States. You can't see it from Europe, and the reason is GDPR. And GDPR is a far more sensible set of regulations than the new copyright directive. But what's likely is that a lot of sites, and I'm not talking about the big giants, a lot of sites are going to simply block Europe. And so you may not be able to visit this Lord of the Rings message board anymore. The other thing that's likely to happen, if you're the owner of this small community website, you're not really making any money on it. Maybe you've got a few ads up to help cover your costs. Maybe you make $100 a month, and it's your hobby, and you've got a little bit of a hobby income. Well, you're gonna think, you know what, it isn't worth it. It isn't worth the risk, because the penalties could run, into quite serious amounts of money. And so what you may say is, sorry everybody, we're gonna have to move, and we're gonna have to become a Facebook group, and we'll let Facebook deal with the legal risk. So there is a very strong chance that the smaller, more authentic, older places on the internet will be very directly threatened, and actually will be pushed in the direction of having to go for the bigger platforms. The other thing to look at and worry about, and one of the things that we do worry about in Europe and should worry about, is the question of entrepreneurship. If I were advising a young entrepreneur who were doing something around community-generated content, I would say to them, you know what, Europe's about to become a very difficult jurisdiction for you. You may want to consider launching in the United States instead. And that's a terrible thing to have to say when Europe badly needs innovation and the growth of new resources and so forth. Well, I could go on for hours, but I think I'll just stop there and we can carry on.
I do have at least one follow-up question at this stage. I mean, thank you for this outlining of a number of issues of principle, and I think I can follow all of what you said, but one of the things that's worried, or that's made me wonder really, as I'm trying to get my mind around the issues involved, is the people who are going to be impacted by this, I think, on the consumer end, tends to be people we refer to as the millennials, who really use these, who basically exist in the bubble of sharing and all that. So I rarely see any reference to them. I don't think they've been given a voice in this. I don't think anybody wants to give them a voice. And you mentioned the word community, and this is why I'm not driving at. What would you say needs to be done, or can be done to get the community, or to get actually people involved in this? And why aren't they out in the streets protesting? Because this seems to me to be a massive change coming, and yet I see so little public awareness.
Well, I think one of the problems is when you sit someone down and you start to say, let me tell you about the new European copyright directive, you have to like poke them a couple of times to wake them up again, because you just said the most boring thing in history. But we see this everywhere. I mean, certainly here in the UK, millennials are very upset about Brexit, and the truth is, when the vote happened, they didn't vote. Young people don't turn out to vote in as many numbers as they should, and getting their awareness and attention to come out on the streets is always difficult. And of course, there are planned protests across Europe for this Saturday. I don't think that's going to be really feasible here in the UK, because hopefully we're going to see millions of people out protesting Brexit, which is obviously massively occupying the news attention these days, which is correctly so. And so unfortunately these issues get a little bit slipped under the rug, and it's a really hard thing. And so for Wikipedia, I guarantee you all the kids who were trying to do their homework yesterday noticed in Germany that Wikipedia was down, and they read about it, and now they've learned about it. But unfortunately, it's quite late in the game, and it's hard for them to make their voices known to the members of the European Parliament. That actually, what I think should be done here is to vote through most of the package is fine. There's some perfectly sensible modernization going on, new protections for public domain. But if we could vote down Article 13 and Article 11 to give a pause, to go back to the drawing board and say, look, what are we really trying to accomplish? And can't we accomplish that without doing fundamental damage to the openness of the internet?
Thank you. Jan Adorn is a member of the European Parliament who is concerned about these things, and it's thanks to her we are here today discussing these issues. And again, I'll offer you as a sort of a starting point one of my own musings, looking at it, at the whole thing again. It seems to me that, I mean, on the radio yesterday, as we talked on my show, you said there's a very strong lobbying effort that's been put forth by the rights holders. They've gone to the Commissioner, Andrus Ansip, they presumably the lobbying members of the European Parliament, they're everywhere. Now there's another side of the story, and this to me seems to be the consumer, the person at the other end of the, whatever it might be. But what I want to ask you is that my experience of the EU has always been that it's been a champion of the consumer. It's one of the saving graces of the European Union that it's always stood up for the little person, in its standard setting, in its rules, regulations, so on and so forth. The little person has been able to say, yes, I've gained something from the existence of the EU. On this issue, it seems to me the EU has completely switched sides and no one is in the corner of the consumer of the internet. How has that come about?
I would start from the thing which Jimmy spoke about, why it's so hard to get to people with this knowledge. One thing is that it's extremely boring. This document is like 80 pages, very technical, very boring text, and you have to make an effort to read it and to understand it, what's in there. And the problem is that on Tuesday my colleagues are going to vote in favor or against, and I believe that those who are going to vote in favor, they just did not read it. And if they did, they might not understand. It's too technical. But if you try to speak to people, I had a meeting with my wonderful voters in Narva, in Roro Club. Roro, it's wonderful hipsters place. I tried to explain what's going on with copyright directive, and each time when I said word hyperlink, one people got asleep. And the result was that in an hour everybody was sleeping except me. Then I wake up, made me a big applaud, make selfie with me, and went home. It was I didn't get them. And it is also the same in the parliament. We had a huge protest, but protest was in the internet. But decision makers are living in the world of paper newspapers. And there were several fake news which were like really spread in the parliament. These are bots. These are Kremlin bots, these are cozy bears, these are I don't know who else. Last time we had this discussion in our group meeting in the parliament, and I was told by my French colleague that, these people who are going to protest on Saturday, they are paid by Google. They are not paid by Google, they are paid by European digital rights, and Google is contributing to digital rights, but it is a small amount of money they're getting, And there is another thing, there is a strong narrative that we are defending creators. We are defending creators that have to get a fair remuneration. But this document does not give them fair remuneration. For this is just one sentence there. We're speaking about copyright holders, and author is not necessarily a copyright holder. If you are a journalist, you are writing for a newspaper, then your publisher will get some money, but you will not. But this is very strong narrative, and people really believe that they will get this money. They will not. That is the problem. And another thing is why we are in a hurry and we want to vote on Tuesday. Nobody knows what will be the next European Parliament. Maybe we will have, far-right populists, whatever there. And it may go even worse. So we just have basically 1 month to finish. And yes, I will also be happy if we can vote it and exclude these 2 articles. And we're trying to do so, but I'm not sure that we will succeed.
Again, I represent no one here but myself, and just issue. I get this very Orwellian feeling. I mean, I have started to take the internet as a right, regard it as a right. It's a public good. I expect it to be there as long as I have battery and Wi-Fi. And suddenly this is going to be taken away. And all I hear, I mean, our platforms, rights holders, 80-page documents, and there seems to be, to me, there seems to be a basic disconnect here. I don't know who to blame, really. Probably politicians.
Yes, you have to blame me definitely. And you're right. You're right. I didn't succeed to convince my colleagues. The thing which I remember very well when I argued with one of my colleagues, and I told him, look, you just do not understand how internet works. And he answered me, and what? I have no idea how my phone works. The main thing is that I'm able to make a call. This is exactly the approach from which we are making decisions, which is not normal. And if we speak about loggers, yes, I mentioned it yesterday in the radio. Commissioner Ansip, who is in charge of this directive, he had about 100 meetings with all kinds of people, and 87 he had with rights holders. And he never met a single NGO and a single person who is dealing with digital rights, which is not normal, frankly speaking. But this is exactly this, you know, they are lobbying hardly, and as it is very technical, very complicated file, it goes like it goes.
Someone is going to write a very interesting book one day, but it will probably be in hard copies that we'll have to buy it, and whether we'll be able to quote it will be a different issue entirely. Does any of you, I mean, Emilia or Jimmy, do you want to interject anything at this stage before we go on to questions from the floor?
Well, I think it is unfortunate that we don't have anyone from the rights holder side of this in this debate, because then it isn't really a debate. So that's not a very helpful point, but I hope somebody asks a challenging question, because we're kind of all on the same side so far.
Okay, I'm sure this is going to be a fairly Estonian experience, where nobody will initially put up a hand for about 5 minutes, and then everybody will want to ask a question before the thing's over. But let's hope, yes, please, prove me wrong. And also, please say who you are to obviously ask a
Use
question.
microphone, otherwise Jimmy won't hear. Yes.
Okay, my name is Marcel Polaja. I'm a member of the Czech Pirate Party. I have a question that is political, which is mostly or usually how the legislation goes through the European Parliament is that there are rapporteurs who pay attention to the legislation, and that not every single MEP understands it, but they follow what their group position is. Now, what we can see here in the copyright directive, we can see that the groups are split. Like half of the group is in favor, half of the group is against. And my question is, why do you think this is the case? What's so different in this directive that the groups are not united?
I have a risk to be not politically correct, I mean to be not polite enough, but I have a feeling that this is very strong French lobby. Really, this is very strong French lobby, and now they somehow get Germans with them. As you know, this directive was blocked in the trialogue like a month ago or so by 11 member states, and Germany was among them. But after they had like kind of several rounds of negotiations, and now Germany is fine. Due to this exception, which was mentioned by Jimmy, for so to say newcomers, for platforms who are younger than 3 years, who have a turnover less than $10 million euros and less than 5 million users. But it means that after 3 years they have to close down and to move to Silicon Valley or whatever. So this was a deal somewhere in the Council of the European Union. But the problem is that nobody knows what actually is going on in the Council of the European Union. We don't even know the position of each member state. They are acting like they are electing Pope by just sitting and waiting until white will come from chimney. This is a problem. Nobody knows what's going on there. Who and how made the deals? What was on stake? We don't know. And this is another problem, you know, they're just not transparent. But final decision was made in the European Council, in the Council of the European Union.
I'd like to put a follow-up question both to you, Milan and Jimmy. You've obviously tried to lobby, I assume, European politicians on this issue. How much do you think that this might actually be an issue, or it might boil down to, if Jana is right, to France and Germany wanting to get one over the US, because the large platforms are all American and the legislation is European? Or is this too simplistic?
I think there is something to that. I mean, certainly the people I've talked to at Google and Facebook do express concerns that European Parliament in general may have a certain level of unhappiness and you know, certainly when we look at Facebook, for example, all of the scandals that they've faced definitely makes it hard for people to listen to them on other issues because you just think, I mean, you behave very badly in so many ways that it is hard and it is unfortunate because one of the concerns I have is that if we're in a world where these are battles between Google, Facebook, and the other commercial internet giants versus the music industry and the movie industry. Well, the public gets lost in that. That's an industrial battle between two giant industries, and simply finding some compromise between the two may be completely out of step with what we need for internet users. And so, in this case, I think that we're more aligned with the commercial giants, just in terms of they also have a very strong interest in an open internet. But it is problematic that we don't really have a very strong consumer-led, consumer-based lobbying organization to speak for internet users. Not yet anyway, but I'm afraid we're going to have to create one.
Thank you. Yeah.
Yes, thank you. Couple of comments. Some of the more political one I will keep for myself. But I think you both mentioned very important thing, which is what is the real reason behind this directive? Is it about really improving copyright and making it fit for the 21st century? Then I dare to say that the key ideas behind the directive are not really addressed this. Do you want to improve copyright? Every right holder tells you the problem is the legal enforceability. Courts take ages to decide over copyright infringement cases, and this doesn't really help. The e-commerce directive that has been working for years and that is providing this safe harbor to online platforms has something like a secondary liability. There is a clear notice and takedown procedure, and if platforms are being noticed about them hosting some copyrighted material and they do not take it down, they can be held liable. So this article that the new directive is not bringing much new. Then the problem is, and then again the right holders will tell you, the problem is that the courts are too slow and the right holders will never really manage to get what they deserve. So here's the problem, but the directive will not deal with this. If it's about US platforms being too big, then let's talk about competition laws. Let's talk about maybe reforming competition laws. But again, the copyright will not deal with this. What will happen will be the harm for the smaller platforms, for smaller publishers, and in the end for the consumers. And yeah.
Thank you. Next question, please. Okay. The gentleman at the back. I recognize the gentleman. Yes.
Hello, I'm a journalist, but I also own a couple of music stores and probably former owners soon. What kind of material we are talking about? Movies, okay, music, okay, but is it also about pictures, like building, photos, texts, or is it, do you know even answer, or is it decided later? Like one sentence is okay, two sentences are too much.
That's a brilliant question. Please have a go, all of you.
Well, I mean, this certainly applies to all types of content. Copyright applies across all kinds of content. And in terms of very specific detailed questions about how much can you quote of something and so forth, that of course is a very particular and individualized type of thing around fair use. But I'll let someone else answer.
Yeah.
Frankly speaking, I don't have answer to this question. Today, one of your colleagues from, I don't know, it was radio, I think, made selfie of him with the logo of his radio and asked, is it infringement of copyright? Yes, it is. But it is copyrighted content. And I really don't know, I mean, to which extent will you vary the filters? I know that, for instance, one filter of what you call magic, which is able to recognize 10,000 songs, costs like 900 euros per month. I don't know what is the amount of filtering. I know, is it possible to filter absolutely everything? But no, it can go to absurd, you know. You just make a picture in front of any building, and if architect is still alive, this is infringement of copyright, no? And if you are already filtering something, how do you think is it possible to cope with this? I'm sorry, I'm playing moderator if I really don't have answer to this question. And when I ask my colleagues, they say, no, it's under control. But how?
Yes, please, ma'am.
No, one of the issues is that it is a directive which needs to be implemented in all the member states. So we will see when it comes to Article 11 and when it comes to the snippets length, which says now individual words and short excerpts, like what this is going to mean. Well, it's going to be a heaven for litigator lawyers because there will be litigations in every single member state about what this actually means.
There's also European law. Sorry, I cut you.
No, please.
Now, that's what I wanted to ask Jan again. Is this thing reversible, and if so, how? I mean, if it should, if it should prove impossible to implement, if it should look a bit like Brexit on the internet, for months.
If you tell me that Brexit is reversible, I would be very happy, but I'm not that optimistic, but who knows? The problem is that we are regulating internet, I mean, we in European Union, from different commissioners and different DGs. And the regulation is overlapping and contradicting. A few months ago, we adopted ALDE Video Services Directive. And it's absolutely clearly stated that ex-ante monitoring is forbidden. This is exactly this monitoring which we are going to introduce now on Tuesday. Audiovisual Media Services Directive applies to audio video content, and YouTube, for instance, yes? But this directive we're discussing now also applies to YouTube. And in one directive it's forbidden, in another directive it's necessary, which means that it leads to court. And it will take some time to get I don't know, any kind of clarification. So at the end of the day, tomorrow, if we vote on Tuesday, it will not be implementable. And it will take time until, like many member states, I don't know, our holder or platform will go to court, and then we'll wait, I don't know, for several years to get rid of one of them.
I feel like saying I want my lawyer present, please, as a consumer. Anyway, anyone else, please? Questions? Right.
Asking as a person who's not informed about things, why is this thing a directive and not a regulation?
Who wants to do this?
Directive is, if I say it very simply, it's just European law. It's European law which is which each member state has to follow. That's why it's called directive.
What a regulation is?
I would say regulation is substance of directive.
Anyone? No. This is very, very, very much an EU matter. Yes, please.
If I may, now, regulations are directly applicable. You do not need national law to apply them. Directives are addressed at member states and they become effective as member states implement them in their national laws. So the question of why a directive addressed at member states instead of a regulation that would be directly applicable was the meaning of the previous
This
word.
is very interesting, but may I also direct you to say who you are? I mean, all of you, please.
My name is Peeter Ratsküla, I'm an attorney at Trinity.
Thank you very much.
And I believe that the idea behind introducing this SA directive was because copyright in general is very much country specific. There are big differences between member states when it comes to copyright, and copyright is always sort of locally applicable. So I think that the idea was to set some principles, but also give member states flexibility to merge the directive principles together with the local legislation. Whether this will in practice work, this is another question, and of course the tricky part with every directive is that if we are talking about unification of the digital single market, then directives usually are not going in this direction and might actually cause otherwise.
But correct me if I'm wrong, there must be a sort of rights-based European angle to this. I'm sure, I mean, copyright issues are important, but if consumer rights or my personal rights are being infringed by this new setup, surely this could be taken to the European Court of Justice eventually. Am I wrong here?
Sorry, you are right, but if I'm speaking about national legislation, for instance, there is exemption for non-commercial use, but there is no definition of non-commercial use. For instance, I have Facebook with 5,000 friends and 6,000 followers, and according to French law, it would be commercial use, due to the fact that they have that much followers. So it would be, if we're speaking about Estonia, yes, we don't still have this definition in our legislation. We don't know. And the same applies, for instance, for fair remuneration for the authors. This is up to member states to decide.
Right.
So if you are, this is answering your question, can you go to European Court of Human Rights? It depends on which country do you live and what is the definition in this specific member state, what is commercial use.
What about countries that have said that the internet is a human right, whatever that means? I think Finland's done that.
I really don't know, but I know that, for instance, in Finland and in Sweden, they are really good in this in paying directly to authors, not to copyright holders, which is not the same as I said.
Thank you. Yes, please.
Hi, my name is Ivo Kruusamägi and I'm a Wikipedian. And also, like when I create video articles, again, I'm also creating something, so I'm a creator. Now, in this case, I would like to ask, and I don't understand why, for instance, in European Parliament, maybe many people don't really understand that well on how internet works or how maybe computers work, because many of them were, let's say, born way back before even like computers were widespread. But for creating or some animals just writing something, I mean, this should technically be understandable. Copyright itself should be at least more understandable to those representatives. And even if I, let's say, write a comment to some Estonian news site, let's say Postimees or Delfi, again, this is also creating content. And this also applies there. Why it is so hard from members in European Parliament to really understand about even the copyright in this current case? Where's the problem there?
It's a problem, but if you, every parliament is like, I don't know, kind of mirror of society, There are different peoples in there. And as you know, if you're speaking about people of my age, I don't know, I'm 52, I'm 50 plus, some of us really hate all this kind of devices. You are trying to speak to your child and he's sitting in the device somewhere, yes? We think that these people who are living in Facebook, somewhere else, they just no need. And if you go and say to voters like me do, for instance, well, we're facing censorship in the internet, they answer, fine, great. It's not a good place. Internet is a bad place. You have to read paper books. And we made a small survey here we got the results previous week. Sarah Paul made a survey and we asked the students several questions, and the students are fine with filtering the internet. They believe that this is a good thing. And there's a problem really. But I still believe that somebody can decide what is good to read and what is bad to read. And another thing is that we're trying to regulate this part of internet, which we can regulate, but we also have dark internet, and we have absolutely no idea how to regulate it. It's not doable, and that's why we are kind of this sublimation. I don't know, by regulating the thing which we can. So yes, it's not easy to convince people, but there are people, and not many of them, who just don't understand. What the hell are you sitting in the Facebook the whole day instead of speaking to your grandma?
So there might be benefits to this after all. Yes, would you like to comment? Do you want this, perhaps?
No, I mean, I'm just thinking, I don't really understand it. I'm quite old myself, and I understand copyrights. So I want to make sure there's no excuse.
Right.
Yeah, well, I think that it's an extremely good point, and I think it goes back to my sort of first line, which is we all agree that you know, like the rules need to change, and we all agree that people deserve to be paid for what they created, and that the piracy is wrong. So I think that when the problem has been that the discussion has been very simplified, and then there are the details that sort of go under the carpet. And the second problem is that it has been very politicized.
Let me try another sort of interjective question here. The EU is always very, very big on best practices. Would there be legal models for the EU to borrow from, I don't know, in the States as well? Would there be precedents where, the US is a huge market where these issues must have arisen a long time ago. Would there be something that the EU could just borrow, perhaps, that would make more sense than this directive?
I believe that the idea of the European Union, of the Commission, was to come up with the new rules. So there was this I think that globally the copyright has to be somehow adopted to the digital age. Then the question is how to do that. I believe that the Commission simply felt like they can create those rules and be the first ones. I think that the same applies to privacy. The European Union was also the first one to introduce GDPR. So I feel that the EU overall feels that where there are no rules, we need to, not no rules, but where the rules need to be adopted, we should make the first step.
It's about to, it seems to me that the EU is about to cut off its nose to liquidity.
That might be the unintended consequences that we were pointing out, that we are pointing out to.
Well, in this way, I think, you know, for me, this, where they've really made a huge error is around this small and medium enterprise exemption being so poorly drafted, because there are a lot of very small and very beloved places online that are older than 3 years that are not particularly commercial. If they had said it only applies to platforms with more than 10 million in revenue and more than 5 million users or something like that, and left out the length of time, then it would be, it would still be bad, I would still be opposed to it, but they wouldn't face what they're about to face, which is the real destruction of a lot of very small, very innovative, clever, fun, lovely things online that have no real impact on music industry revenues. So I think that would be a massive way of improving it, just right off the bat.
Understanding the collateral damage issue here seems to be a major industry. Right, anyone? Questions? Go ahead. And then
You already have the microphone, so.
right, okay. That's an advantage.
Hello everybody, I'm Carl, and just to kind of play the devil's advocate here, but perhaps to spark a new point of view, I'm just wondering that if this, like why we're against this directive is because it boils down to money pretty much. You know, it's like you have to put up these filters and then, you know, consumers going to be harmed because they have to perhaps pay more for the service. Then isn't it kind of strange that, you know, we're also used to getting all of these things for free? That, you know, you go to YouTube, you get it for free, you go on Facebook, you get it for free. Everything is for free, free, free. And now that we want to regulate it, somehow people, you know, will have to start paying for the stuff that they consume. Couldn't it actually be a kind of I don't know, a good lesson for the consumer that they actually cannot get everything for free or really cheap. And therefore, you can also put the pressure via the platform that's actually offering these free services, because they are creating the behavior that is making these kind of ideas fester. Thank you.
Right, who would like to fill this?
If I may, for the beginning, you know, you're speaking as if copyright protection doesn't exist in the internet at all. It does. It does. And if you see, I don't know, still a video, you just have to let them know and they will take it out. It's not a problem. It already exists. But the idea of filtering itself, I don't know, I'm that old-fashioned, you know, lady. It scares me. I was born like, maybe not you, but some of us here. I was born in Soviet Union and I remember what is censorship. And I really don't like somebody to decide. And it applies also to Article 11 about this hyperlinking and other things, you know. If I understand it rightly, maybe you will correct me, you will not pay for this hyperlink only if platform has a kind of agreement with publisher, which means that platform will decide which links are shareable and which are not. Somebody will create my media space. I don't like it. And this is about not about copyright protection. This is about freedom.
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's a mistake. You know, what we see today is a huge amount of revenue growth for paid for content through the internet. So if we think about video, we think about Netflix, Amazon Prime, Hulu, etc. With music, we've got Spotify and others. And those are booming businesses, and consumers are willing to pay for content, and that's already completely fine. And what they're receiving from, for example, YouTube is not, you don't go to YouTube and download and watch a whole season of Game of Thrones, because YouTube doesn't allow that on the platform. It gets deleted automatically very quickly. But what you do is you go to YouTube to watch videos created by amateurs. You go there to see, I like to cook, and so one of the things I do, I go on and I watch some ordinary person like me who likes to cook, and they explain how to make a certain dish, and they show you the technique. That is what the real internet is about. That is the vibrancy of an open internet. And that person who's making a video, they don't necessarily want to get paid. If they get really popular, they may ask Google to join the program to share the revenues, but for the most part, people just want to create things, share things, do things online. And they want to do that and have a little bit of music playing in the background, which nobody would really think of as piracy, but which is technically a copyright violation, or it could be, because we don't have sufficient space for consumers to make normal use out of copyrighted works that are in their lives, that we all would think is completely fine to have some, you know, a little music playing with your children's birthday party when you send it to grandma. It's just a thing that we should have. So I think it's a mistake to imagine that we should have to pay for a service like YouTube when that isn't even about the kind of content that you want to pay for in the first place.
I'm beginning to visualize what we're about to lose.
No, I just wanted to point one really quick thing out. It's just that I think that at the moment already the censorship happens, but it happens on platforms because platforms decide what they want to allow on there and what they don't. So I don't think it's fair to paint the world that, you know, there's one where we have this free internet that you can do whatever you want, and then there's the other internet where we have censorship because of EU directives. It's just that, you know, if you don't like something on Google, if you don't like something on Facebook, they have all the rights to delete it, to block it, because it's a private platform.
There are several very clear criteria. So this is hate speech, if it's discriminative, and so on and so forth. It's just not anything, but, you know, and things always can get worse. That's exactly what we're facing now. And if I come back to what you said, we had all these demonstrations in the European Parliament, and we had also White Lejean who came to Parliament, and who was absolutely against this directive, and his reasoning was, I don't know, I understand it very well. He said, okay, all these poor children who are listening to my music and trying to do something out of it, trying to mix it and trying to play it, and if we make them to pay, they cannot afford it, and we're basically building obstacles in their creativity.
But they can release the copyright.
Milan's.
Yeah, a couple of quick comments. First of all, whether this is only about money or something else, I think David Kay will be speaking later on. Will be also talking about very important freedom of expression implications. So it is not just about the money, although I'm worried that the primary reasons for actually coming up with this directive were financial. And when it comes to YouTube and other platforms, yeah, there are different online platforms with very different business models that are good for different users. Jimmy mentioned the music ones. When we start with music, for instance, there are platforms like Spotify. People are openly willing to pay for that. We are also introducing subscription models, so people can use YouTube without the advertisement. And the advertisement model, it's another model that is good for some users. That there will always be users who do not want to pay for music. That is a fact. And for this certain amount of users, there can be YouTube. By the way, YouTube is a minimum. It's just a couple of percent. Music is just a few percent of overall content on YouTube. It's marginal. And when it comes to people who want to listen to YouTube, and by the way, there is still some revenue, as I described it before. If they want to listen few hours per month on YouTube, well, the same principle applies to something that is much older than this radio. Radio is working on exactly the same basis. People are not paying for it unless it's a public broadcaster, and the radios work based on advertisement. So this is not anything new.
This is something I understand. I use Tidal personally because I like CD quality music and I'm happy to pay for it. Kari, please, Kari Aso.
Yes, thank you very much. I will keep my comments related to human rights aspects for the next panel. But I wanted to ask, and I wanted to point out some remark that YouTube is not really free, and the other platforms that use advertising model, you actually pay for it with your personal data. So it's not free. It's actually quite expensive when you think about it. But when it comes to platforms, I see that Article 13 puts the platforms like YouTube in a kind of impossible position in terms of, on the one hand, having to respect the rights of the rights holders, the intellectual property rights, and on the other hand, trying to also having the obligation to respect the freedom of expression. So my question is to you, if this comes to pass, so let's hope it doesn't, but if it comes to pass, what will be the position of Google and companies like that in this case? Because you do have obligations coming from international human rights law, you do have obligations that come from, it's not only about the European law, and also the question of potentially challenging this in the courts. So I would like to see what kind of game plan do you have for this future that we don't like to happen, but might be likely.
Well, thank you for the question. This is something that, of course, we are discussing internally a lot, and I must say there's this important caveat. We really need to wait to see what the final directive implemented in all the member states is going to look like. Because before that, it is very hard to say what we might do and how we might operate. I think we are going back to the situation, and you very nicely described what are the basic principles. Is the sort of freedom of expression, of course respecting legislation, meaning respecting the current copyright rules, and any future rules that will be enforced. And we will need to think how to combine this, how to really and by the way, I want to say we are already licensing with rights holders all across the world. Sometimes you might come across the situation when you play YouTube in Germany, some of the content is not available because we haven't been able to come up with a conclusion with the right holders on the licenses. So we will just need to try to figure out an approach that will balance all these different things. But what it's going to look like is unfortunately too early to say.
View from Wikipedia on this?
No, I I agree completely, so don't have anything to add on.
Okay, Jan?
Of course, I cannot answer what Google will do, but already due to GDPR, we have a long list of global publishers who left European market. The share is small. I don't know, my daughter is working for Canadian news aggregator News 360. European share is like 11%. And if you are not able to comply with this legislation, you just leave. You know, the world is big. And this is exactly what happened in Spain when they tried to ask money for hyperlink. There is no Google News in Spain as of now. So it might be the next consequence for Europe. We are thinking that we are kind of, you know, center of our world. In fact, why not?
Right, who was next in line? I think I'll take you. I saw you first, and then I'll take. Next.
My name is Silva Ferguson, I'm a member of Central Party, and Milan, I would like to ask from you. I am writing my own articles, I am doing my own videos, and now Facebook is blockading me for 1 week, then for another week, because I am putting it not only at my page, but in different talent groups. I think it's because you want my money, you want that I put my credit card, and then I can show my articles, my video for money. So I understand honestly why it is, or you just don't understand, and who is doing some activities, you are just blockading him for any use. For me, it's a question, because if I will putting some porno or something that is prohibited, then I understand why people are blockading me. But when I'm putting my own opinion, what I'm writing myself, or when I'm putting my video, I can't understand why I'm blockading for 1 week, and then almost after 1-2 hours for another week, and that else, because I think that my opinion is okay, it's not criminal. No. Otherwise, police will come, they know where I'm living. And for Jana, I would like to ask, Jana, this week we had such things what happened in Tallinn, that some person who was drunk, he said some words about the Jewish president. And police take him for 84 hours. He became a criminal, and his flat was checked. Yeah? And another person wrote about Helme, that he wanted to kill Helme, and Estonian police said that it's okay. It's not a criminal. Can you give your opinion?
Can you please give microphone to Oksana for the next question, and I will answer yours. We are speaking about hate speech, and hate speech is out of scope of today's discussion, but I will, with my greatest pleasure, discuss it afterwards. Yes, we are speaking about hate speech. And why do they block you? I don't know. I'm on Facebook for 10 years and nobody never blocked me. I will give you some lessons.
Would any of you like to speak for Facebook? I somehow doubt that. But
Just the one thing I wanted to say, that what has come up a couple of times is questions about, to the extent that the biggest platforms have a lot of power to determine what is on their platforms, which can constitute censorship for whatever reason, or one of the concerns that will be most relevant to what we're talking about here is if we give them a financial incentive to overblock content that isn't actually a copyright violation, that's a problem. But this is one of the reasons why I'm so deeply concerned about what this regulation will do to the smaller places online. You want to have an alternative. If you can't put what you want onto one of the big platforms, you'd like to have a small platform. You'd like to have another place you can go and draw attention to your work that you own and you control. And if you have huge legal risks for smaller message boards or other kinds of platforms, it's a huge problem because we drive everybody onto big platforms, which is a single point of failure, which is very unhealthy.
Thank you. And I believe this is going to be the final question of this section. Thank you.
Thank you very much. My name is Urmas Ambur, and I'm from Performers Association. Sorry, I'm on the wrong party, but
you have to come here. We'll miss you.
Just to give some examples, the turnover of Google was few years ago 3 times more than our state budget, from 32 billion, and our state budget is around 10 billion. So you said before you have paid some 800 millions to right holders, very nice numbers, thank you very much. But you have like video streaming platform, 1.8 billion users. And if we compare with Spotify and Deezer, they have 6 times less users and they are paying 6 times more money. This is like a remark. But what I wanted to ask, you said before that you are using content ID and this is a very successful tool to recognize right holders. We have offered to YouTube, we have data in format what you would like to use, metadata, but nobody cares. I have a feeling that Estonia with 1.3 million inhabitants, it's not a big deal to Google to shut down YouTube or not. We are not playing even a small role in this business. What you think, how you will protect like national repertoire in the future if you're saying that you are interested to have metadata, to use correctly content ID, but actually we don't see it. Thank you.
That's for Google.
Thank you very much for these comments. First of all, on the Spotify versus YouTube, the numbers you described are being very often repeated, and it is true that based on one listening, there are different amounts paid for the right holders from users on Spotify and on YouTube. But I'm going back to the fact that these are different services. These are different services, and different users are using them. Also, you cannot really put them against each other. Because very often people who are using YouTube, who are listening some amount of music on YouTube, are also Spotify subscribers. I'm one of them, and I think most of the Spotify subscribers also sometimes play 1 or 2 or a couple of songs on YouTube. So these platforms or services are actually to a large extent complementary. By the way, we've seen some numbers of people who are listening on YouTube that are more likely to then enter and start using Spotify and become paid members. So it's a little bit about this apples and oranges comparison, which when you look in more depth, it is not as easy as if you compare how much per month is a right holder being paid from Spotify user or from someone who listens some music on YouTube. That is comment number 1. And the comment number 2, content ID. Indeed, we are unfortunately unable to provide to provide content ID to everyone. There is a certain limit of content that the right holder needs to have to be uploaded and then to be used. This is extending over time, and right now we can offer content ID to much more right holders, or many more right holders than we used to before. There are some requirements which, in fact, some right holders decide not to follow because per week they need to check how many of their content has been re-uploaded, and they need to act upon it. So there is one thing to that. But what I last point on this, on Estonia, on Czech Republic, where I'm coming from, on smaller markets, here is the concern. If we as a platform need to enter into licensing with every single right holders, we as a platform might not easily able to do that. So we might only be able to enter the licensing with the big right holders, the big record labels, the big collective societies, and we will not be able to do that with the small ones. So what might happen in the end is that due to the directive, small indie label from Estonia, small video creator from Czech Republic might not be able to upload their content on YouTube, even if they want to, because they know that it is having a multiplying effect and it is a great tool. They will not be able to do that because the platforms will not be able to go into such a risk of liability.
Right, I fear it is now my task to bring this session to a conclusion. Any final words, Jimmy Roberts?
Thanks everybody for inviting me. I really hope that if you changed your mind in my direction, then you will get in touch with your NEP. If you change your mind against me, then please have a lovely day and don't call anyone. I think everyone who is interested in this issue needs to speak about it to as many people as possible. It is incredibly important. We joke that it's boring, but it is, as you'll hear in the next session, which unfortunately I won't be able to stick around for, there are also a lot of human rights implications around what does it mean to be able to express yourself online. And those are as important as the commercial considerations. So thank you.
Thank you, Milan Zubic.
I think I've said it all and I took so much time. Thank you so much for the invitation.
Yeah.
I just have to thank Jimmy Wells for finding time and sitting and looking at us and seeing nothing, I believe, in your monitor, but at least yes, we're here. And Milan, also for you for coming. We're very grateful, It was not easy to get all these people into this room, but nobody left, so you're great. Thank you.
And I'd like to thank you all for being here, and I think I might have a name for it. Should the directive pass, the Finternet. Thank you. That's it. Bye.
David K is already waiting in the internet, so we have to continue immediately now. Yes. And yes, our pirate is coming in a second.
So don't go anywhere. The internet is still in danger.
Okay, you have to say that you have to tell it to after.
So we shall be taking 5 after all. Please take 5.
And David Kane is incredibly interesting. Please stay.
Yes, please do come back after 5 minutes.
No. I mean, we are already here, and he's waiting in front of his computer. Получилось? Спасибо. А телефон тоже можно? Окей,
I see you. Hi there, I need to close the live stream here so I don't hear you twice. Okay.
We can't see you for some reason.
Oh, that's my fault. Hold on a second.
Great. There you are. Probably can see me. I am Clara Mrs.
I thought.
We are just setting everything up right now.
Yeah, great. Okay.
Do you want to stay on standby?
Yeah, we can just do standby. I'm gonna close the audio and video for a moment.
Great.
And just tell me when you're ready. Okay, thanks. No, but so the difference is if you enforce it like this. So the difference is that when you enforce it proactively, it's for or if you retroactively.
väga head eksperdid on minu
üks inimene Skype'is kasutab tekib küsimusi kindlasti volikogu esindajatele.
aga siis te ütlete, et ma tulen siin ekspert, ma olen siin sama.
Yes. Hello. I'm not quite sure what you wanted, but I'm looking straight at you.
I see you.
Right, okay, great. I am the moderator of Topics, and I'm awaiting a couple of stragglers. We're waiting for stragglers, I think is the way to put it. So maybe a minute, 2 minutes, and then we'll be launching this second session of today's event. Just
Right.
Right, I think without further ado, I'd like to declare this session open. As I said, I'm the moderator of Topics, and we have a panel. And again, I must apologize, my glasses aren't what used to be. I am looking at David Kay, who is prominently present on 2 screens in the room. We also have Marcel Kolaya from the Czech Republic, we have Kari Esper from Estonia, and we still have Yana Toom, the host of this event, with us. And this panel is supposed to tackle the impact this copyright directive might or might not have on fundamental rights. And I'd like to start off with David Kay, as you are joining us via Skype. I can't even think of a leading question here. What are your views on this? And then perhaps we can go on to more specific questions and comments later on.
Great, so thank you for including me. Yeah, maybe I could also just ask whoever's got the Skype to just mute the audience so that I don't get feedback from myself while I'm speaking. So I first want to thank Jan Toon for organizing this event and for including me here. You know, the copyright directive, for those of us who've been following it for so long, probably believe, and I imagine that's most people in the room, we probably believe that everything that can be said about the copyright directive and about copyright in Europe has already been said. So what I want to say, what I want to maybe articulate a little bit is, rather than getting into the weeds of the current draft and the negotiations to this point, which many of you in the room will know to much better detail than I will, since I've mostly observed from from the comfort of Southern California. I want to talk a little bit about framework in which copyright issues generally and the copyright directive in particular being implicated by. So my role as the Special Rapporteur for the United Nations on freedom of opinion and expression is to monitor free speech issues around the world. And of course, over the last 5 to 10 years, that has meant that so much of our expression is mediated by online platforms, and of course also by governments that want to impose restrictions on those platforms and on speech of users, on expression of users. So I just wanted to say a few words about that framework in which at least I think about freedom of expression, in particular online expression. If this is a little too basic, I apologize, but I think it's useful, particularly in the European context and in the context of a debate that often gets, I think there's a threat that the debate becomes very technical. I want to step back and think about that framework for a moment. So the main set of norms that I look at when I examine particular threats to freedom of expression or alleged threats or merely policies and laws that might have an impact on expression, the main guidepost for me is Article 19 of both the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. It's quite similar to Article 10 of the European Convention on Human Rights, and it basically provides two sets of norms that I want to talk about. So the first set of norms is about the rights that we enjoy as individuals, and that means that everyone enjoys the right to seek, receive, and impart information and ideas of all kinds, regardless of frontiers and through any media. And I think that right, if we think about the nature of that right, or that set of rights, I think it's really useful as a guide to think about copyright, right? So the first is, what is the substance of the right? It's seek, receive, and impart information and ideas of all kinds. It's a, this was drafted in the 1940s, and it is a full and fulsome set of rights. And in some respects, it is the greatest statement of what it means to enjoy freedom of expression. It means that my right to share information is protected, and my right to receive it and even to seek it is protected. Another part of that right is that it's regardless of frontiers. So while international human rights lawyers may often, and governments may often debate over the extraterritoriality of human rights law, the freedom of expression is something that we're guaranteed across borders. And so I think that also may indicate, to a certain extent, one of my concerns about the copyright directive implicating not only European users, but also users worldwide. And that's, I think, part of the conversation that is often not taken into account. And then the last part of that right is that it's through any medium. And so, again, to my mind, there's a sense that the drafters of this language really articulated a future in which digital tools, even though they couldn't even imagine them in the 1940s, that those kinds of tools might be available to people down the road. So that right is a full right, and I think it's something that we need to protect jealously in the context of whether it's political speech or it's creative, artistic speech protected by copyright. That is a fundamental set of norms that we need to keep front and center. The other part of the normative framework you find in Article 19.3 of the ICCPR, and it's very similar to Article 10 of the European Convention on Human Rights, is that when states impose restrictions on freedom of expression, they must meet three conditions. And those conditions are that they must be provided by law, and I'll come back to that in a second. They must be provided by law, they must be necessary and proportionate, and they must be necessary and proportionate in order to protect a legitimate governmental objective, a legitimate public interest. And those interests include the rights or reputations of others, public health or public morals, or public order and national security. So it's a fairly narrow set of legitimate restrictions. But the two parts that I want to focus on, which really guide my thinking and my approach to looking at the copyright directive, is the first is provided by law. The jurisprudence around that language really emphasizes that it's critical for law to be clear not only to be adopted by regular process, which of course there is a regular process taking place in Europe to adopt the directive, but the language itself needs to be clear enough to guide users, and that I would say includes intermediaries, to guide them as to what is on the lawful side of the line and what's on the unlawful side of the line, what's protected and what's not protected. And I think one of the real serious concerns that I have about the copyright directive is that the language, as the debates indicate, the language is it's capacious. It is subject to all sorts of interpretation that really create concerns for me about whether if adopted as drafted now, whether it really meets the provided by law standard. The second standard that I want to talk about is necessity and proportionality. So we tend to think about necessity and proportionality as a set of guidelines, you know, for all sorts of individuals and for companies to understand from government or intergovernmental agencies, from public authorities, when it is necessary to take a particular action against particular expression. And I think to date, despite the years of discussion around the language of the copyright directive, I think it hasn't really been clearly articulated why the particular language of say, Article 13 is necessary in order to protect a particular public interest. There are other alternatives to the current approach, which are less intrusive into freedom of expression. And I think that we really need to be thinking through what are those other alternatives. Do those other alternatives, which there are a range of them, do they protect freedom of expression online in a way that doesn't create the same kinds of interferences? And are governments actually articulating the reasons for adopting current approaches in that context? So to my mind, and I'll stop in a moment because I know there are other speakers and I'm interested in hearing them as well as you must be. That is the framework in which I look at the copyright directive, and to be honest, the way I look at all potential restrictions on freedom of expression. And I think looking at the way that the draft is articulated right now, and the restrictions would be articulated right now, I continue to have serious concerns that that particularly the companies, and you know, by talking about the companies, talking about all sorts of companies, because the lines will be drawn in such a way that it would be difficult to understand necessarily what kind of content falls on which side of the line, that the incentive to take down content will inexorably lead to taking down legitimate content. That is my fundamental concern. I truly believe that it's important to modernize European copyright law, and in fact, copyright law in other jurisdictions around the world. But I'm really concerned that the approach that's adopted here, which moves, I think, significantly away from principles in the e-commerce directive, really risks it having negative impacts on freedom of expression for creators, for artists, for individuals who are simply seeking access to that kind of information and those kinds of ideas. So I'll stop there. You please turn on the audio on your side so I can hear you. But thanks so much for your time.
Thank you for this. I think I might chance a short follow-up question. This has been very, very thought-provoking. We've had the first panel dealing here with the ins and outs of copyright law as such, copyright issues. It seems to me, listening to you, that we might be involved, the EU might be involved in a serious category error if copyright legislation becomes a source of restrictions on the freedom of expression. And it seems to me that this is not a conflict of public values or goods that are of equal importance. The freedom of expression, to me at least, a layman seems to be something that should always come first. And this puts me in mind of debates in the United States regarding large platforms acting as media for the exchange of ideas and whatnot. These should be seen as public utilities and regulated accordingly. So I'm just wondering if you could comment on this, whether the EU is just going about this completely the wrong way around from your perspective.
That's a great question. So I wouldn't want to make a, should turn down the volume so I hear myself. So I wouldn't want to make a categorical sort of response to that question. It's a very broad question, and I think you're right. There's a huge debate over how we think about intermediaries today. And from my perspective, what I'm interested, well, I'll say two things in response to that. So one is, I don't fundamentally think that the copyright directive is a category error. I think there are things that clearly need to change to update and modernize copyright law. I'm not really disputing that. My concern is somewhat narrower, and it's about the impact on not just creators and artists, but also on the public space in which individuals get access to creative work. But also not just creative work, it's also political work and satirical work and all sorts of expression that is part of our shared cultures and our national cultures and so forth. So I think that you're right to ask this broader question about, should we be conceiving the platforms as essentially public utilities, or should we be considering them as traditional media almost, with editorial control and so forth? And I think that's a really good debate to have. I'm afraid we may not have enough time to drill down into all the implications of that. And so I'm really focused on, in part because the copyright directive is happening now, I'm really focused on sort of the more specific concerns about the particular language we have in front of us right now. But I think it's a really important and great question.
Right, thank you for this. I promise to be more focused in what comes next. Marcel Kolaja, you represent the Czech Pirate Party, if I'm correct. Now, the thing that I'd like to instinctively ask you is whether you don't think that the pirate involvement in all of this has served and will serve to further marginalise the issue in public perception, or do you think that's an unfair view on this?
You mean that, thanks for the invitation in the very first place. Thanks for our attendance, everybody who is joining over the internet. Maybe I need some clarification on the question. So what you're basically saying is that the pirate party being involved in it is marginalizing the problem.
Sorry, I blindsided you. This was not my intention. All I wanted to say was that with all due respect to the Pirate Party, we have a liberal here, but we have no conservatives, we've got no social democrats debating this. And if people simply look at these, look at the representation here, they might automatically think if it's something that interests the Pirate Party, it might not be an important issue. So essentially, you have a huge problem convincing the public that what you're doing is the right thing, and I think what you're doing is the right thing.
Okay, I'm getting the question now. So, honestly, I'm not sure where this really comes from. The Czech Pirate Party is one of the strongest parties in the Czech Republic. We have 21 out of 200 seats in the lower chamber of the parliament, which is the third biggest party in the parliament. And since that happened, which is fall 2017, we've been getting better and better in the polls. So we're currently polling at 18%. And we are being, and I believe that this is the evidence that we are being seen as an important party, and we represent a lot of people in the country. So
I stand corrected. I
yeah,
stand corrected.
yeah. So I don't think we are kind of the party that might, you know, attract the opinion that this problem is actually marginal. Maybe I'll reintroduce myself again. My name is Marcel Koya. I'm a member of the Czech Pirate Party. I am the leading candidate in the European elections. And maybe just to reinforce a little on what I have said, our goal is to win the election with 20%. So I'll go in my short speech, I'll go directly into the message that I want to send, which is the copyright needs to be reformed. We have heard a lot, you know, from David Kay and also from the panelists before, and I'd like to elaborate a little on it. So if we do not do it, if we do not reform copyright, and if we keep enforcing the old ancient copyright that currently is in place, will always lead to censorship. And this copyright directive and the Article 13 is exactly the evidence of it. The copyright is outdated. It works with an old last century model of, let's say, producer to consumer flow, where you have like a small group of producers that are feeding into these consumers, and they have their distribution channels, they have, you know, their label companies, and, you know, everything is perfect. Consumers are paying for the music, the movies, the articles and everything, but that's no longer the case. And even like the copyright works with the idea that everything that it solves is basically commercial and to make a living out of it. And that's no longer the case today with the new digital era, with the internet. Everything has changed, and everything is much more complicated because there is the internet brought the option to do remixing by what was supposed to be, or who was supposed to be in the past, the consumers. So now there is no clear line between the consumers and the producers. The copyright still, we have the copyright if we thought that it's still the case, and we're trying to solve the problem how to pay the authors for their works. But it's much more complicated these days. The new creative ways of remixing include internet memes, for instance. So let's say, my favorite example, you take a picture from Star Wars of Darth Vader, and you put your popular politician quote on top of it, right? And you share it, and people make fun of it, and it's really cool. It might happen to me in the future as well. And it's really cool, and it does not cause any harm to anyone. Like, who is supposed to be the author that is going to starve because of this? That just makes no sense. But technically, at least in several European countries, this is illegal. This is copyright infringement. But so that does not make any sense in the new internet digital era these days. Copyright is about show business, basically. It's about the top producers, label companies, publishers, and it's protecting them so that they get paid.
copyright is never going to solve a problem of, genius authors, of revolutionary artwork, as we are being told sometimes, or very often actually. Very often when I run into into a discussion or a debate about what's bad, what's right about copyright, that it's always the argument. It's like, oh, so how the authors will, get paid, and then they come with the example of someone, like really genius, and one is, buying their artwork because it can be downloaded on the internet. This has never been a problem for the biggest ones. It will never be a problem for the biggest ones. They will deal with it with or without copyright in these days of the new internet digital era. The internet brings new distribution channels, and it's much easier for them. They just need to adopt their business models. And it's never going to solve the problem of these, genius authors that we are being told the copyright is going to solve the problem. No, it's not. It has never solved the problem, and it will never solve the problem. I think it was several times told in this discussion already, this copyright directive is basically about regulating the biggest platforms, Google and Facebook. Like let's be fair. This is what the Article 11 and Article 13 is about. Well, the copyright is not the right law to fix this problem. It's all about money. It's all about publishers versus platforms. It's about the music industry versus platforms. So it's like Axel Springer and Google are fighting, like who gets a bigger share of money. It's about the label companies fighting with Google and Facebook, who gets a better share of the money. But so where are the users, I ask? Like, this is the main problem. Where is the public interest? Like David Kay talked about the public interest that must be there. I asked where it is. So this is basically a fight between giants when they are protecting their current business models. And what I say is users should not be punished for the kind of remediation that the Commission and the Parliament is trying to do here between these big players. And this is unfortunately the case with Article 11, 13, and that's really, really, really concerning to me because it really touches the fundamental rights. So there are real problems that need to be solved, but outside copyright actually. Think of, I'll give you an example from the Czech Republic. So Google is definitely an internet giant. It's basically close to a monopoly. And the Czech Republic is kind of special. There is a company called Seznam, and that company has some share on the market, and they are able to make money out of it. So they pay taxes, because everyone should, and they pay the income for the last year, for instance, they paid an income tax of roughly 10 million euro per that year. However, Google in the Czech Republic paid only, well, definitely under 1 million. I don't know if we still have someone from Google here in comment, but it's like, it's unfair. And the legislators know it. And what I feel here is that they are trying to fix it, but they are trying to fix it from a wrong end. Copyright is not going to fix that problem. So that's one thing. Another thing is, and I'm close to the end already. So platforms are in power of, deciding what content we are being shown and what content they are hiding already. They already have what do you know what is on your Facebook wall? It is like, how do you know what is there? Like, what is the decision, what is hidden, and what is shown and what is deleted? So I think we need to regulate how they do it, and they need to be transparent about how these decisions are made. And this is, again, nothing copyright can solve. The internet is an important place today where people, meet, they interact, they create, they share fantastic things. They express themselves. So my message to legislators is, like, do not mess with it to fix the business. Do not mess with the fundamental rights. Thank you.
Thank you. That's a very clear message. Kari Kasper from the Estonian Human Rights Center. What is a right? I think I should ask you. Is copyright a human right? Is the internet a human right? Is freedom of expression a human right? How do they stack up?
Sure, thank you. I'll try to be brief. Of course, we're talking about, we can frame it as we're talking about two human rights, or two different human rights. And human rights is like a package deal. So you have different rights within this package, and sometimes they support each other, and sometimes there is a need to balance them against each other. And here we talk about the question of balancing the freedom of expression with the very rightful rights of property, right to property of the intellectual property owners. So you can frame it really as a human rights-based kind of debate on how to balance these topics in the best possible way. And here the freedom of expression side, I think, was very well put by David Kay, and I don't think I am a better expert than him on this topic. So when you try to use this right to property or enforce this right to property better, this cannot come at the expense, or this cannot come too much at the expense of the right of freedom of expression. And this is what seems to be the case in this copyright directive, that the balancing is off. The way things have been balanced in this fight between the giants is so that the human rights, in the end, they lose. We end up losing something that was very important for us. In a broader kind of context, what we are seeing is the impact of the technological transformation. So we know that the ICT changes everything, and we are in the middle of this. And through this change, this also has an impact for human rights. So we can say, yes, human rights, we will have the same human rights again in the future, but that's not entirely true, because we have to kind of reformulate or reconstitute these human rights for the digital age. And this is what is happening somehow indirectly with the copyright directive, that the balancing between different rights is getting off. It's not in the right. It goes outside of this proportionality and necessity that there should be. And we have been tracking this at the Estonian Human Rights Center. So we are a general human rights organization. So of course we think about both of these topics, and we think about these because these are important topics for us. Both of these sides, I would say. But this is not our main focus of area. We never thought that there would be a big threat to freedom of expression in Estonia or in Europe. We thought that things have been settled. But now through this copyright directive, these discussions have been reopened. In a way, we had these discussions already when we had in, let's say, 2010 or so, we had the Court of Justice decisions in the Scarlett Extended and Sabam cases, which talked about the responsibility of the intermediary. And there it was very clear that the intermediary is not responsible for the content of the users, and that has been the basis of European law ever since. And now with this directive, they are trying to change this in a way, or they're trying to change it while not saying that they're changing it, because that seems to be the outcome that will in any way happen. So we have been quite vocal against Article 13 and Article 11 of the proposed directive. We have been sending also, together with our other colleagues in the human rights movement in Europe, we've been sending letters to the European Parliament, to the Council of European Union, and the other parties involved, but there hasn't been really any significant change, and these voices have kind of been left, they have been left, they haven't been taken account of really. When you look at what this outcome is now, it's even worse perhaps than what was there at the beginning. So in addition, what we have for us, of course, the main, for me personally, I would say one of the main problems is this shifting of this responsibility to the platforms. And do we really want a world where human rights related decisions are made primarily by big multinational corporations? Do we want a world where human rights, your public space, your opportunity for speech is being decided by this Google, Facebook, other platforms like this? And I think that is a very slippery slope to go to. I think that is where the regulators are trying to push the issue because they think that this can, work for them because it's kind of good to kind of bash these platforms. And of course, they have done quite a lot of bad things. If you think about the fine that Google just got from the European Commission for their anti-competitive practices, then of course you are right to be against them. But in this case, I would say that they are not, on the wrong side. So that is one problem that I think we cannot give this decision-making over so fundamental issues as expressing your opinions or receiving information to these companies to such a large extent and use copyright as one of the excuses to do so. So you have to, even if you have filters or not, in every case you need to have some sort of independent mechanisms to challenge these decisions when they have been, the filters are incorrect. So how can you challenge it? Right now it's very opaque. You can't really see how it who makes those decisions and how you can actually challenge those decisions. And this is a problem already now, and this will only be accelerated or exaggerated when we talk about when hopefully the directive will not, but if it does go into effect. The other potential threat that I see for human rights defenders, such as ourselves, it could be that these are used maliciously. So they're used against the small forums that Jimmy Wales talked about. So if you don't like some topic, if you don't like some discussion, you don't like feminists, you don't like people who have a different opinion, you just shut them down by making these rules so difficult to follow that they cannot have their own platform. They have to, they cannot get supporters, and that is, I think, also a big problem. And finally, I would say, as an exercise of European policy and making and legislation, it's also a very problematic area, because usually we think about the European Union, we think about someone who protects human rights. But more and more, in more and more cases, whether it's with asylum, the deal with Turkey, the issues related to criminal justice, the European arrest warrants, there are cases where European law and European Union itself is, or now with the terrorist content, removal legislation, the EU itself becomes the one who violates human rights or potentially violates human rights. It's no longer the champion of human rights that it actually promotes. And I wanted to mention here in this context the role of the Charter of Fundamental Rights of the European Union. That I think there is a high likelihood that this directive, if it gets passed, and I think we should stop it before that because we're just going to use a lot of resources, will eventually get challenged in the courts and will not stand in this forum, I would propose. But the bigger problem is that what happens when it actually goes into effect? What happens when these people who are used to uploading stuff as they used to do it before, they can't do it anymore. There is suddenly a limitation for these artists or just any other content creators. And who gets the blame? The EU will get the blame. It will weaken the EU, it will weaken the EU legislator, because I think the national governments are more than happy to blame the EU for this, when they're actually the ones who are behind it. So I think I see there also a big problem that if you want the EU to be this human rights champion, it needs to also act as one.
Thank you. Let me try and get something straight. Granted, we are reconstituting basic rights for the digital era. But that can't surely mean that at the end of the process we'll end up with fewer basic rights or differently conceived basic rights. Again, it seems to be going about things backwards, or am I wrong?
If you think about the history of human rights, universal human rights, it's not that old. It's 70 years. It's on the 10th of December last year, we celebrated the 70th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. It's a post-Second World War creation, and we take it in many ways for granted, but we don't know what will happen to it when this paradigm shift technologically, socially, economically takes place. So we have to be very careful that we're not losing, trying to make these decisions about copyright or economic issues, that human rights are actually not left on the back, they're not left as a secondary thing, but they should be the first thing. And here it seems that the human rights aspects are not the primary motivators for either the legislator or the different lobby groups who are working with this.
Right, thank you. Any quick rejoinders from David Kay or Marcel Collard at this stage?
So I agree with that last comment wholeheartedly. I think that's a really important point. And I think that, and I would just take it a slight step further and say that in thinking about the way, the way Europe wants to structure rights and protect users, but also protect artists in digital space, I think there really needs to be attention not only to the rights specifically in Europe, but also how the tools that are adopted in Europe will spread globally and in the wrong hands can be used in a way to really severely restrict expression. And one of my concerns, and this is across the board, I mean, this is not just copyright directive. I mean, to a certain extent, copyright directive is not the most important issue in this context, but we see a lot of action around terrorist content, around hate speech, and other areas where, in the democratic space of Europe, you can imagine, okay, this could be articulated and implemented in a way that is protective of rights. But Europe, particularly given its role as I would say the leading actor right now in the human rights space, really needs to be cautious about the kinds of tools that it adopts, because they can be misused, and we're seeing this. And so the question is really an important one. What we're seeing around the world is, that the early idea of digital space being this, nirvana for human rights and access to information. Governments around the world are using the digital space for purposes of surveillance, for restriction, for disinformation, and so forth. And we just need to take, and Europeans, I think, need to take that broader global view and that global responsibility in mind when considering tools like this.
Thank you. What's the comment?
Yeah, I can only agree that introducing legislation that is concerning with regards to human rights will weaken the European Union. So we should be really, really careful in this space. And in the end, it might be used in the nationalist groups, against the European Union. And however, if you look at how the MEPs from the respective groups vote, you'll definitely find that, ENF MEPs who are in favor of this legislation. And if by any chance is anyone from these groups, from this group and other nationalists listening, then I would say, well, why do you want to introduce a European-wide legislation if you are against the EU? So vote this down, please. Thank you.
Thank you. We are now in overtime as per the official schedule. Do we have time for questions?
I think yes.
Okay, in which case, yes, shoot. And please introduce yourself as well.
My name is Alex. To protect copyright, to protect intellectual property, laws are imposed. I guess that's the purpose of this EU directive. But do the Estonian people really benefit from this intellectual property thing more than they lose from it? I mean, or the Czech people. I mean, Hollywood is not in the Czech Republic, the latest Apple iPhone is not invented in Estonia, so what's the benefit to our two nations? Is it bigger than the costs?
I was hoping to keep the questions rights related, but if anyone wants to feed this one, then feel welcome.
I think you got an answer during the first panel when I think it was Google representative who said that our creators and our authors have nothing to do with this brand new world. We're too small. I don't know how about Czech Republic, but Estonians, I don't see that any Estonian publisher would benefit from that. But it was very interesting for me, shame on me. I never thought about that in that terms, that we have to reshape human rights in digital world. I mean, we were discussing all kind of making things better or worse, of changing things in the light of digitalization. But we never spoke in the parliament about human rights in digitalization. I'm not a member of the respective committee, of course, but I've never heard about that. And it's really interesting. For me, it's the best outcome of today's discussion, I have to say. But I mean, for me as a politician.
I started off this. I was confused at the beginning of this. At the beginning of this event. Now I'm afraid. I have to say. Anyone else, please?
Maybe if I
yes,
address from the Czech
point
of view. But I'll basically repeat myself a little. So first, the copyright needs to be reformed. Second, I talked about the competition to Google in the Czech Republic, and as they are paying taxes, and Google is avoiding taxes in the Czech Republic because it's taxing in tax havens, but it's nothing to do with copyright whatsoever.
Thank you.
Right, next question. Hello, so my name is Henry. I happen to be one of the organizers of Fridays for Future protest last week in Tartu. So I believe I represent the millennials that will be living with this new directive for the next years. So my question comes from the side that, if we fight about climate change, I believe it's fair to say that there are many monetary powers that would wish to not to that people wouldn't succeed in fighting climate change, wouldn't succeed in cutting the emissions. So if we consider a logo of the movement made by somebody's mom in their home, is there a possibility that a corporation could have a shelf company contact YouTube or Facebook that, hey, our copyrights have been infringed, and therefore you have to limit this movement or their actions or their presence?
Well, it goes right to the heart of this.
Can I just give an example of this? Perhaps millennials know this Babadook, right? And the Babadook is an intellectual property creation. This from this movie. or that was adopted by the progressive movement, by the LGBT movement as a kind of a symbol, this Babadook with a rainbow flag. And then, of course, there comes the issue that what if the rights holder now says that no, you can't use it like this. They allowed it, but if that is the case, this would be something. If we wanted to, destroy this movement, take away their symbols, that would be possible. But if that's also possible now, that's not really the directive's fault. It would be made, the impact would be worse, because then you would not be able to upload anything using that logo or using that theme song. Can be anything that you use to rally people behind you. There can be visuals, there can be videos, there can be different types of expressions that you use, and then suddenly someone says that no, we have copyrighted this, you cannot use it anymore, we can't put it up anywhere in the social media. So it also represents, so here talk mostly about the freedom of expression versus the right to property, but the freedom of expression is linked also to many other rights, like the freedom of association and other related issues where the right to privacy might be affected as well. So there's a lot of kind of potential threats that we don't foresee, and that's the problem with technology. Like with technological change, you have this kind of the butterfly effect that you never know what your today's good intention even causes in the future. So with any kind of technology regulation, and I think there should be a regulation of technology now, that it shouldn't just be a Wild West, but you have to be very careful about thinking through what is it that you're going to, and you have to kind of build the regulation to be flexible and to not close off certain things. And I think this is sadly the case that might happen in this situation.
Seems to be the millennials are going to get old very fast. David Kay, any comment?
No, I actually don't have anything to add to what's just been said, but your last point and the overall tenor of the question, I think, is really critical. This is we're talking about regulation that is not just about the current moment. I mean, it's not as if copyright is amended every couple of years. I mean, the approach that's taken now needs to take into account not just the internet that we have today, but the internet that we're going to have 10, 15 years from now. And I'm afraid that, just as we talk about generals fighting the last war, that's what we're doing right here. And so we really do need to be thinking not just about the next generation of individuals, but also about the next generation of the internet and how this has an impact.
Yeah, when I was listening, to David Kay and Kari Kasper, there's one thing that I have in mind, which is the copyright is supposed to be here to support creativity. Now, with this legislation, there has been some concerns with Articles 11 and 13, how it's going to be bad for platforms like Wikipedia, for instance. We have discussed that in the first panel. So then there was introduced an exception for online encyclopedias like what Wikipedia is. But the problem is that we don't know what will be the next revolutionary project that just does not fit these criteria, and we are going to restrict it. Like, no one, before Wikipedia was found, no one really had the idea of a community encyclopedia, and when it all started, it was perceived like, oh, this will never take off really, because it needs, all these publishers that, work on it, etc. But it works. Free software, open source software is another example. It was not created by copyright. It was not created by politicians thinking about like, oh, what could possibly be creative. But it still found a way, despite copyright being here, and was more a pain in the you know what than supporting it. It was not politicians who found successful business models, how to make money, and not restrict users, software users, so that you can produce open source software and still making a lot of money on it. So the possibilities are huge, and we need to make sure that the legislation is not restrictive in it. And I'm really concerned that the current copyright approach is, oh, so there's Wikipedia, so let's put exception to it. So where is the creativity? Where is the space for creating any new project that the politicians just currently don't know about, because no one knows about it at this point, but we'll know about, someone will think about it in 10 or 15 years.
That's a very good question. Any more questions? Over there, please.
Just, Anilo Kuusamäki, again from Wikipedia, and I'd just like to add on this one, because, again, as mentioned, Wikipedia is our creators, but the way how we sort of fight with fake news and all of that is that we sort of require that everything is referenced to reliable sources. Now, this is again one of those things where this part really directly affects Wikipedia. If you would lose access to some of, let's say, news sites, for instance, all of the news sites again would be under this new copyright directive anyway. And if some of them, for instance, decide that, okay, Europe is maybe not that important to us, or there are some other issues, or for instance, the same thing about can I publish something or not, then this is again very relevant to several countries. There are several countries in the world that have very great censorship. And how can you create a decent Wikipedia there if the materials you can access are very they're already, let's say, pre-selected? What do you know, what is even true? And is this sort of the future, or how should Wikipedians themselves build a decent encyclopedia if they sort of lack the access to all the materials?
Right, there's knowledge. Right, who would like to comment? Perhaps this was self-explanatory.
No, I'm sorry, I just had to answer to my son. I'm sorry, so I was not there. But I've got your question, and I believe that this, what you said about Wikipedia, this is exactly the reason why they shut down the German edition and something. So it's really something that I also yes. I don't know why the student is still open. I don't understand.
Yes, perhaps you can respond to that.
No, he will tell us.
I can actually mention one of the reasons why we didn't black out this time is because already half a year ago we did a blackout in the student Wikipedia to protect directly against this directive. So we already did it half a year ago, if some of people remember, but of course it was in summer, so it wasn't maybe that hot broke around. But if you now go to the student Wikipedia, for instance, one of the things you may notice is there's this big thumbstone in replacing the Wikipedia logo, thumbstone for free internet. So we are indeed protesting.
That's great.
We still have 6 MEPs, and previous time 2 of us voted against this directive, but 4 voted in favor. So you have to put pressure on those 4. And unfortunately, still in the Council of the European Union also supported this directive, which is shame in my view, but it was not my decision, as you understand it.
There was another question here.
So hello, my name is Sander, and what I like about the European Union is that we have a diversity of opinion, and I think you all agree. But my question is, when we have so many different viewpoints from the far left to far right, conservatives, liberals, everything good, and why cannot they all come together and find a common ground? Because they are all basically, I suppose, standing for the common people, not for big corporations. So why can't they find this common ground and vote against it?
But they have come together, and the place is called the European Parliament.
Yes, but if some people take vote against
I will take a risk and think that, yes, I know that they're streaming to the internet, but I really believe that, at least to some part of my colleagues, this is kind of I would not say that this is corruption, that's something like, yeah, you know, if you act in favor of big publishers, you get space. You get space in newspapers, in TV news, whatever, you know. And we are approaching elections, actually. So, you know, if I go and argue with, let's say, I don't know, big newspaper, it's absolutely clear that this big newspaper will not help me during campaign. You know, this is not like that. But in fact, it always somewhere, you know. Okay, I don't understand who all these people, all these strange hipsters writing me, you know. That is exactly what I was told by Index Talent one, why he voted again in favor of direction. He said, I'm really tired of all this spam, I don't need it. I have to delete every morning like 200 mails. I'm fed up. Just, no. I will put, nobody will put a pressure on me. This is what happens in Reddit. So, what about common ground, you know? Interests are really different, and these guys are really good in lobbying. They are really good in lobbying, you know. I've never seen, not a single guy who is standing for digital rights knocked at my door. No, that never happened. But all this Universal and Sony and other, from the morning till the end.
So the real question seems to be who invented the email. If Index Talent really was swayed by all this spam. Anyway, I think our time is now up, and I'd like to ask you for a short round of final words, and I'd like to start with David Kate.
Well, thank you thank you to Yana and Tom for inviting me to participate, and thank you to everybody for to my co-panelists for thought-provoking interventions and for the questions. I only want to conclude by saying, in a way, what's the rush? The last set of questions really, I think, directed us toward thinking about this as a long-term issue, and it needs to be done correctly. And I think that the tools that we have through the frameworks of fundamental rights can actually help us think about the long term. And I would just really urge all those who are considering this issue and voting on it in the coming week to think about that framework and think about the long term, not just the immediate term and the immediate industries who might benefit from it.
Thank you.
Okay, so thanks everyone for coming and showing that this, plays an important role too. And I'll follow up on the phrase the elections are approaching. So let's turn it around. It's not just the publishers that have something to say here to the MEPs. You can also send them emails. Of course, be polite, but I think it's fair to say if you break the internet, it breaks my vote for you. This, I think, is the last opportunity to do it. The election, the vote is next week, so it's probably too late to call to the office because the MEPs are no longer in the office and they show up in Strasbourg next week. But it's still not too late to send the email. So that still can be done. That's one thing. Another thing I wanted to say is what I have seen in the discussions when I discussed with the MEPs is not really understanding the subject, because if you are not an information technology expert, as I am, then you might not understand that, for instance, the filters required by Article 13 can never be made true. Like, an automatic filter can never decide 100% correct whether something is copyright infringement or just a funny meme. And, well, if you don't understand the theory behind it, and then it basically breaks mathematics, then you might believe that, that it's fine to implement a feature that will just disallow to upload a material that is copyright infringement. So it's not possible. And I think that in the new digital age, we just need more information technology aware people in the parliament, and the elections are, the great place to express that opinion. So thanks everyone again, see you next time. Thanks for having me.
Thank you, Colin.
Yes, I also thank for this invitation and the participation, the chance to participate here. I think for me, this discussion here shows, but also the wider trends, is that human rights should not be taken for granted. You have to fight for them, and if you don't fight for them, if you are not interested, then bad things will happen. Bad things will happen to you and will happen to other people. So, if you care about something, educate yourself, make other people aware, and also, show what you think. Because I don't think, people think that these big corporations, the publishers, they have all the power. No, they don't. So if you, come together, it's possible to challenge these things. Like if you think the example with ACTA, it was possible to challenge something that was almost a done deal. And big protests, a lot of pressure, but it eventually worked, and there is no ACTA. So these kind of things, and ACTA of course is much more complicated than some sort of copyright reform, because it's an international treaty, trade treaty. So in this case, I really urge you to think more about your values, if you think human rights are important, how you can support them, and how you can, not only say that you support them, but also do something concrete about it. Thanks.
Thank you, and for my part, my thanks go out to both the panelists and the audience. I have learned a lot, thank you, and I'm handing over to Jonathan for her final words as host.
Thank you everybody for coming. Thank you for not sleeping while mentioning hyperlinks and other complicated things. And thank you also to those who watch us in the internet. And of course, you coming from Czech Republic and you're not sleeping. It's time to sleep, I understand where you're in there, yes, but so thank you everybody. It was really very, very interesting also for me, more or less acquainted with this topic, but I have several new ideas now. And even if this thing will pass in the parliament, I believe that it will be very complicated to implement it, but it is not the end of the world. But on the other hand, we can also be politicians. We can also make things even worse. And we try sometimes. And it's absolutely right what was told about, I think, David and Marcel also, that, we're not according to absolutely all polls. Young people in Europe are most pro-European. But if we now will break this internet, will not destroy maybe, but destroy freedom of speech in the internet, they definitely will not be that pro-European. And you're absolutely right that local governments will be happy to blame Brussels, like it always happened. If it's something good they did, if something bad then Brussels did. And then nobody knows who voted in which way in Council of the European Union. It's easy to blame Brussels, which leads to Euroscepticism, and finally it's really bad for European Union. So please show up tomorrow and write to your MEPs. Please don't write to me. I know everything. I don't want to read 200 letters every morning. Thank you, everybody. And Oksana, I know that you have something. But I do it in my mind. Yes.
I'll have to come to Estonia to pick it up.
Thank you.
Thank you.
No,
Bye.
thank you, everybody. Bye.